So there's lots of resources out there that'll help you out if your snake ends up being stuck in its shed. Ideally, when a snake sheds, the entire thing will come off in one piece. Other times it might tear in a few places, like it'll shed the head and neck off, but then the rest will be stuck, so it'll shed that off separately, and eventually it'll all come off itself. But there's other times where the entire thing just gets stuck. Now, like I said, there's lots of things you can find on how to get that stuff off. I've also done a video on that. It's a few years old, but it's still relevant. But something that people don't talk about quite as much is how to actually avoid and prevent this in the future. Sheds that are left on for too long or get shed off like multiple times, like if a snake is in shed and then some gets stuck and then a month later it sheds again, then it can eventually cause skin damage. And if the eye caps are left on, it can cause eye damage, and enough buildup on the eyes can cause permanent blindness. Now, you don't have to panic. If you realize that your snake is stuck in shed, you can get it off, but we can go ahead and be a bit more proactive and avoid this happening from the very start. So there's generally two variables that'll affect how well your snake sheds. The first being the humidity, and the second being what your snake actually has to shed on. Humidity is the moisture in the air, just like we measure it by percentages. You can really tell the difference it makes, like in the winter versus the summer in most climates around the world. Like in the winter, usually your hands will be a lot more dry, at least mine are. And then the summer, it'll be softer and obviously more moist because there is more water moisture in the air. If it's too dry, it'll be all crusty and stuck to them and kind of hard to just get off. So the more moisture that's in the air means that the smoother and softer it is, so it'll just slide right off. And then when it comes to what the animal actually has to shed on, it's just what you literally have in the enclosure. Is it just substrate? Is it just glass or plastic? Are there different hides with different surfaces, whether it's rough or rocky or smooth or whatever? These different kinds of things affect just how easy it is, because they can't just walk through the air and the shed comes off. They need things to actually pull that shed off of them. So humidity is based on four main factors. Firstly, the substrate that you're using in the enclosure. Secondly, the amount of ventilation in the enclosure and how much airflow it gets. Third, how moist the enclosure actually is, like how much water you add. Do you spray the enclosure or do you just keep it completely dry? Is it in a more humid room or house, or is it in just some random dry area? And then the fourth is what type of enclosure you have it in, because some materials can hold humidity better than others. So substrate. I would say that this is the biggest variable and the easiest thing to change and improve the shed. Now there's another factor, hopefully it's not getting too confusing, and that is what species of animal you have. Different animals can shed at different levels of humidity. So ball pythons, for example, they are from Africa, which is quite a dry place, but they find areas and reside in places that are much more humid around their countries. This means that they are adapted to a higher humidity when they're shedding. The general consensus when they're shedding is like 60 to 70 or 75% depending on who you ask. But then if you look at something like a sandboa or a hognose, which is from much drier places naturally, they're adapted to be able to shed in very low humidity places. So if I stuck my ball python in the sandboa enclosure, it would have trouble shedding even though the sandboa could shed perfectly fine in that. So substrate is probably the easiest and the most effective way to improve and avoid stuck sheds in snakes. Now, like I said, it depends on the animal as to what you use exactly. We can start just on ball pythons to give you a general example. Common things that people use that I don't like to use as much are aspen and paper towel. Paper towel, it works, it's very sterile. I use it when I have to quarantine an animal, but I try not to use it too much other than that. It's also just kind of ugly. And then aspen is a perfectly safe and usable substrate with many animals, but it does not hold moisture like other substrates. Now I've talked about this quite a bit in other videos, so I'll try to cover it somewhat quickly. But the most common thing that I get emailed and asked is when my ball python is stuck in shed, why is it doing it? How can I avoid it? Ask what their substrate is, and 90% of the time it's aspen. I tell them to switch it to one of these, whether it's coconut fiber or cypress mulch. Those are my two favorites, or mix the two. I have them linked below if you want to see the exact products that I buy on Amazon. And these are naturally made to hold more humidity. So simply replacing your paper towel or your aspen with something like coconut fiber or cypress is oftentimes enough. All you have to do is spray it a bit somewhat often. It retains moisture quite well, so you rarely have to do this unless you are in a very dry place. So that's just using ball pythons as an example, but you can find the substrates that work for your animal and figure out which ones can hold the most humidity. You don't want to use wet eco-earth with a hognose snake or something, because that'll cause other issues since it's not what it's adapted to, but you can see what applies for your species. There is, however, a second thing to the substrate that affects it, and it mixes in with what your animal has available to shed on. For example, if you use something smoother, like some people just use paper, because it's very easy to pull out, like printer paper or whatever, or a roll of paper. It's easy to take out and just throw away and replace, but it's extremely smooth, so there's really no grip or anything to pull that shed off on. Paper towel, as long as the humidity's fine, will usually work just fine because it is more rough. Like if you run your hand over it, there will be more, I guess, friction or surface tension. That's water. It'll be rougher, and that means that your animal will have an easier time. However, if you do use things like actual dirts or wood chips, these have lots of textures, lots of roughness to it, so it makes it much easier compared to more smooth things. So the next thing, like I said, when it comes to humidity, is ventilation in the enclosure. This also depends on where you are located around the world, because your house or your state or country or city or whatever is going to have different levels, because that's how the world works. And so I can't tell you exactly what type of ventilation to use, but there are multiple options. You can use plastic tubs. Not all animals can be in plastic tubs. Many others can. You can also use aquariums or glass enclosures. The same thing applies. Not everyone can use them, but many can. And you can use wooden enclosures, which the same thing applies again. I'm not going to repeat it. I haven't worked as much with wooden enclosures, so I'm going to focus on the glass and plastic. And generally, plastic tubs are going to hold more humidity than the glass. I plan on doing a video on aquariums versus tubs, or tanks versus tubs, which I'm sure people will enjoy that. That is both genuine and sarcastic at the same time. But a glass enclosure with a screen top is going to have more ventilation, so there's more natural airflow throughout the enclosure. This might be great depending on what your animal is and how your humidity is, but this will pull out more of the air with that water moisture in it, assuming you added water to it, like you sprayed the enclosure, so it'll dry out more quickly. There are easy fixes for this, like putting plastic over parts of the screen in the enclosure if it is a screen top. Don't do the whole thing, you need your animal to be able to breathe, but if you cover like half of it or 2/3 of it, or just a third, if you only need a little bit of a difference, that will hold more of the humidity in. People also use like wet towels or wet rags, just anything that adds a barrier between the outside world and your enclosure. Then there's tubs. These just naturally, plastic holds more humidity, and tubs usually don't have screen. It's usually something like holes drilled into the side or punched into the top or whatever. There's different ways to do it, so there is less of that humid air escaping the enclosure. But like I said, if you already have your enclosure set up and you don't want to change the entire enclosure because that might be expensive or just a pain or whatever, there are other alternatives like the substrate that you're using. But there are also things like we talked about before, what your snake can shed on. The most simple and basic enclosures that things like breeders will often use are just a plastic tub with a sheet of paper, maybe a ceramic bowl, and possibly not even any hide. Now, the large-scale breeders can just adjust the humidity of very large areas at once, but if you have an enclosure like this does not leave much for your snake to shed on. When it rubs up against the bowl, it might get some off, but because there is no rough texture there, there's a lower chance that it actually will. So you can add pretty much whatever you want. Rough hides, rough water bowls, rocks themselves, as long as they're clean. You can also buy stuff like this. Pieces of wood, pretty much whatever you want that is safe for the animal, but has a nice texture that is easy to pull that shed off with. This, mixed with the humidity at the right level, will pretty much guarantee a perfect shed with your animal. But if you are still having issues, there's more you can do than just this. Now, if you find when your snake is actually in shed or going into shed, you can usually tell because they will kind of dull out on their body. Their eyes might turn blue or get foggy because those are the eye caps about to come off. If you feel the animal, it might feel a bit crustier. The belly might start turning red. Lots of different signs that tell you that the shed is getting ready to come off. Now, I did a video on what you should do if you can't find the shed in your enclosure. You can watch that there. The short answer is it hasn't actually shed yet because they go through a weird process where it looks like they're gonna shed, and then all of a sudden it looks like they shed, but they didn't. You can just watch that video for that. But basically, you can tell when your animal's about to go into shed, and when you do this, you still have time to make even more adjustments. Going back to ball pythons as the example because they're just probably the most popular and easy to explain. Let's say that you're keeping your normal humidity at 60%. This is a very common number that people use, but when the animal goes in the shed and you see that and it's had issues in the past with shedding, you can bump this humidity up, maybe 15 or 20%. You don't want to go too high. I think usually people go up to like 70 or 75% while it's in shed. They don't always have to. I don't have to up mine, but it's something that you can do. And then when you do this just temporarily, you leave it up higher as the snake sheds, and once you see that shed off, you can just lower it back to whatever it usually is. Again, this is more of something like preparation, so the more humidity you add, the softer the skin will become, and the easier it'll be to get off. Even if the animal starts shedding and you think it was going to be fine, but it starts to tear or have issues, you can go ahead and bump the humidity up there. The animal won't just immediately give up. You can also add a water bowl and make sure it's just full of water so that the animal can get in it, but it's small enough so that the animal can get out and not drown. Some snakes will take advantage of this and do a bit of soaking themselves right beforehand. Usually snakes don't need to soak and almost never will. Generally it's not a great sign if they're soaking. And then other people soak their animals right before they shed. This isn't something I'm comfortable doing. Most snakes do not enjoy baths or really being in water at all. So I'd personally only do this if they have a stuck shed and you have to do it afterwards. But it's something some people do and have success with. When they see them very deep in a shed, they stick them in a bath and loosen it up for them. However, because snakes are, again, often stressed in water, and even more stressed when they can't really see because of those foggy eye caps, that might not be the best choice. And then finally, the very worst case scenario, the snake does not shed perfectly. There's some stuck patches, there may be some eye caps you have to get off. You can deal with it, you can get it off. It's kind of annoying, but it's not a huge deal. So you shouldn't panic if you are like, you didn't realize it was going in a shed and you're trying to rush and do everything. Of course, it's not a bad idea to try and work all this out, but it's not the end of the world if there are some stuck sheds. It's very satisfying though, when you find your animal and there's just a full shed, which by the way, a little humble bragging, I haven't had a stuck shed in maybe a year now. There are also other variables that you can do. I don't want to make it too complicated, we've already talked about quite a bit, but even the heating sources that you're using can affect this. It all comes down to how it affects the humidity. For example, ceramic heat emitters, I love using these because they do not let off any light, so you can easily use them at night, but I don't know what it is about them. I'm sure there's a simple scientific explanation, but they dry enclosures out quite a bit. Compared to a heat mat, which heat mats can actually raise humidity, because if it's under the substrate, it'll help more of that water evaporate, which will go up into the air as it evaporates. And just normal lamp bulbs will even not necessarily help it, but it won't hurt it either. So if you are using ceramic heat emitters and there are other options, you might want to switch if you've done all this stuff and you're still having issues with it. Well, there we go. That's about everything I have on my mind right now for avoiding stuck sheds. If you have any other tips, make sure to leave them below. You might have noticed that bearded dragon, which I don't know if it's moved like the entire video. Did she fall asleep? She might have fallen asleep. But we are selling animals over at emeraldscales.com. If you haven't seen that before, you can go learn about it there. We ship to anywhere in the USA. As of recording this, we have 5 bearded dragons available, I think 4 leopard geckos, 2 snakes, and maybe a couple other things. It changes throughout, so you can go check that out. But that's about it for this video. Feel free to leave more ideas when it comes to husbandry or anything else. But I think we're done here. This has been Smokey helping me out, being very patient in my hand. But that's it. So I'm Alex, and thanks for watching.